Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. They weren't poking fun at me, but they mentioned with some degree of humor in their, or mirth in their tone, that I have begun these lesson sessions the same way for years and years. Nobody knows how long I've had the privilege of leading in these Bible studies from Colonial Hill. Nobody remembers. I can't remember the exact start date. It's not important. What is important is that I do, in fact, consider it a true privilege to be allowed to present these Bible studies each Sunday morning. Today's lesson is found in the 6th chapter of Daniel. It contains one of the most beloved, best enjoyed, well-known stories in the entire Old Testament, and especially in Daniel. And that's saying a lot, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace is also one of the most famous, or famous is not what I'm looking for, most enjoyed and beloved stories in the Old Testament. Today's lesson from chapter 6 tells us of Daniel in the lion's den. One writer said that the story of Daniel in the lion's den is the most beloved story in the Old Testament. And then he adds parenthetically, at least according to his unscientific survey taken of those under 9 years of age. What he meant was he asked his 3 children what was their favorite story, and Daniel in the lion's den came out on top. You all know the story, but we're going to go through it and hopefully gain some additional insight and maybe even some additional reminders of what our faithfulness should look like as God's children, as his followers, as Christians. So let's get started. And I'm going to read, our focal verses are verses 10 through 24, quite a few verses. But as usual, we can't get in, I don't see how we can get into the study of the actual verses that our curriculum writers have set aside for us to study if we don't get the foundation or the basis, the context. Verse 10 starts with, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published." What decree? What was it that Daniel learned? And so I think we have to go back to the first. We're not going to take a lot of time on those first 9 verses, although we will reference them because they certainly do set the stage. Verse 1, reading from the New International, and we may read from the New English translation. It's not called the New English translation. Sorry, I was going to look and see, double check that translation. I didn't do so. Reading from the New International, verse 1, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel." So let's start out. Who in the world is Darius? Secular history of this period. So what is this period? Let's start there. We've been talking about Nebuchadnezzar as the king of the Babylonians. We've looked at the we've looked at Nebuchadnezzar and his journey from a pagan god who worshiped many gods to one who finally said that Daniel's God is it, and his dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" Nebuchadnezzar evolved into one that many scholars say is a true believer in the one true God. He had the examples of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and God. Many think the pre-incarnate Jesus himself walked those three through the fiery furnace, as we discussed in our lesson last week. We've seen Daniel interpret his dreams, and Nebuchadnezzar became a believer, say many scholars. Now we turn, well, we go through chapter 5, we pass over chapter 5. A new king succeeds Nebuchadnezzar. He doesn't last very long. The Medes and the Persians, history says on October 13, 539 BC, the Medes and Persians defeated the Babylonians, killed Belshazzar, the successor to Nebuchadnezzar, and the Medes and Persians now rule the known world. So who is Darius? Secular history of this period has no record of a ruler named Darius in this particular time and place that's referenced by Daniel in chapter 6. Oh, by the way, the Medes and Persians took over in 539, and soon, eventually, Cyrus, the king of the Medes and Persians, are going to allow the Jews to return to their homeland. And he even funds them, gives them money to allow them to rebuild, including their temple. But who is Darius? We've asked that 3 times now. There are critics of Daniel, the book of Daniel, the Old Testament book of Daniel, partly because, as I just said, secular history has no record of a ruler named Darius at this time. And yet, Daniel writes, it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps. That's overseers, if you will, commissioners, say some translations, to rule throughout the kingdom, and with 3 administrators over them, Daniel being one of the 3. So it sounds like he is the king. He's acting as the king. Well, David Guzik, in his commentary on the 6th chapter of Daniel, in the Enduring Word commentary, says that many who accept the writings of Daniel and the prophecies of Daniel as being legitimate think Darius was just simply another name for Cyrus. And David Guzik even says at the end of the study, or his commentary on chapter 6, that verse, I think it's 28, I'm sorry, I'm not finding my notes. Oh, there we are. Verse 28, I was looking at verse 26 instead, I don't know why. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And David Guzik suggests that may be a reference to Darius and Cyrus being the same person. To me, it's just the opposite. It is Darius and Cyrus, suggesting two, and is a conjunctive. Maybe that's a translation issue. Some say that Darius was actually Cambyses, who is the son of Cyrus, and he served under his father as the ruler of the Babylonian area. Others say that Darius was an ancient official title known as Gubaru, whom Cyrus appointed as ruler over Babylon. Darius may just be a title, an honorific title, meaning holder of the scepter. I accept Daniel as the Word of God, the inspired Word of God, that he wrote it himself, Daniel. And so whether he is just someone holding this title, whether Darius is, or he's the son of Cyrus, or he is Cyrus himself, doesn't matter to me. He is the king, he is the ruler over Babylon at this time. We're told that, another piece of information. We're in the study part of Bible study at this moment, before we jump into the application part. 539 BC would make Daniel 80 some odd years of age. How do I come up with that? He was taken into captivity, into exile, with the first Nebuchadnezzar foray into and defeat of Jerusalem, when the young intellectual royal family was carried off into exile. So from 39 BC, that's 66 years from 605 BC, when that first capture of Israelites and carrying them off into exile. Well, I thought you said 80. Well, Daniel was 18 to 20 years of age at the time, thus making him 84 to 86 years old when this chapter 6 and the story of Daniel in the lion's den takes place. Daniel is referenced as highly esteemed or greatly beloved. His character is at the highest level. And that's why, and this is part of verses 1 through 9, that Darius is considering naming Daniel not just one of the 3 administrators over the other 120 commissioners, shall we call them, but instead making him the head of all of the administrators as well as the 120 commissioners or satraps. Why? Because those who did not like Daniel because of his high character plotted to get rid of him. At the appointment of Daniel, or the plan to appoint him as the chief administrator, which would essentially make him number 2, at least in the part of the Mede and Persian Empire that the Babylonians now reside in, used to be the head of the Babylonian Empire. Verse 4, at this the administrators and the satraps, this is New International, which is commissioner in some translations, tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of governmental affairs. But they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And that's why Darius was going to appoint him. He has found immediately, maybe it's from personal dealings with Daniel now that Darius has taken over, or from reviewing the records of the administration of the government for the 60 some odd years that Daniel has been in Babylon, that he was without fault. They could not find any charges to bring against him. He was not corrupt nor negligent, that is, failure to do his work. So why were they trying to get rid of Daniel in the first place? The answer is they were corrupt. Now, some would suggest it's just pure old human frailty of jealousy. He was being elevated over them. Some say it is sort of racial. That is, it is anti-Semitic because they came to him, to the king, and it's part of our study verses. After they laid the trap, they said, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. In other words, he's one of the Jews. He has done things contrary to what you have prohibited. And what is it that he did? Well, let's look at verses 10 through 14 real quickly. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, I haven't mentioned the decree. I said I would do so, so let me pause once again. These jealous or corrupt administrators, commissioners, satraps, go to the king. They can't charge Daniel with corruption, which, oh, by the way, affects them because they have been corrupt. But now he's going to be over them. He's not corrupt at all. They can't charge him with corruption. They can't charge him with failing to do their job. So they finally said to themselves, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So they are acknowledging that they are, we hear in the story that they know that Daniel is a God-fearing man and has a relationship with his God. They know about Daniel's God. And so what they're going to try to do is lay a trap for him, put him in a position where he either disregards his responsibility and obedience to his God, or he disobeys Darius the king, who obviously has a great feeling for Daniel. He's going to make him the number 2 man in the area. And so they came up with this plan. They go to the king. These are verses 6 through 9. And they say, all of your governmental officials have all agreed that the king should issue a decree and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or any man during the next 30 days, only 30 days, should be subject to the death penalty. That should be thrown into the lion's den. In other words, they come to Darius and say, hey, Darius, issue a decree. This will unify our nation. It's not said that I'm reading between the lines. This will unify our nation. Everybody will pray to you or not pray at all. And they sure won't pray to some other god. Darius apparently is somewhat flattered. So, one commentary said this proves he is a weak king or ruler. He is being misled and manipulated by lesser corrupt people. And he's, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And he signs the decree. And under the laws of the Mede and Persians, once a law becomes law, it cannot be changed, not even by the one who signs the order making it a law. And so the king signs it. They've set the trap. And so we get to verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem, which reminds us perhaps of Solomon building the temple and saying, everyone will look towards the temple, towards Jerusalem, in praying to God who is going to live and reside in the temple. 3 times a day, that's Daniel, got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or man except to you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, yeah, I did. The decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of those exiled Jews, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Now, verse 14 is very important. Verse 14, when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Why do these administrators, these commissioners, satraps have a problem with Daniel? Because they are corrupt and he is not. Possibly, as I already said, because they're jealous that he's been appointed ahead of them, or he's somebody from someplace else. And so we have a bias against him. It's anti-Semitic because he is Jew. Since they didn't have any earthly weakness they could find in Daniel, they had to come up with some plan. They couldn't, in anybody's mind, falsely charge him with corruption or with not doing his job. And so, as I say, they tried to lay the trap. They sought to create a situation where Daniel either compromised his own faith, thus compromising his witness, if you will, to the rest of the people, or he compromised, they wanted him to either compromise his faith or compromise his allegiance, his duties and responsibilities to the king. So they go to the king and they say, hey, issue a decree. And they lied. They said all of the commissioners of the kingdom, all the administrators have consulted together that the king should establish this prohibition. That was a lie. Daniel hadn't agreed to that. He wasn't even aware of it. He learned about it after the fact. And they did so with the knowledge that their law, the Medes and Persian law, said once it's done, once we can get the king to sign this, it can't be undone. That's fairly unique. It is a good basis for a rule of law, that law governs. And quite frankly, to give Darius some credit, they recognize that he is a rule of law person, and once the law is in force, he will enforce it. But they know that there is a strong relationship between Darius and Daniel. He's planning to make him the second in command. They wanted to take away the possibility that the kings would protect Daniel. So what is Daniel's reaction? Verse 10 says, he learned, New International says he learned that the decree had been made. Daniel, made the conscious decision to continue doing as he had always done, even with the knowledge of what was going on. Now, he could have come up with an excuse, a fairly acceptable one. I've been faithful my whole life. I'm over 80 years. How would a little thing like this so late in my life really change anything? It's not a very good excuse. Everybody else is doing it. Don't you remember your mother said, if everybody else was jumping off a cliff, would you too? Another excuse to say, okay, for 30 days, it's just 30 days. I can hold off for 30 days. Or even this classic one, which I myself have used as during part of the lesson plan lesson study I gave last week, during my wife's illness, it would be far more useful to the Lord if Betsy was alive than if she was dead. So Daniel could have said that about himself. So what did Daniel do differently? Nothing. He continued to do as he always did. He prayed to God at least 3 times a day. He did so in a posture of humbleness. He kneeled before God and prayed to him. Paul wrote in Philippians, and this was also one of Betsy's favorite, if not favorite, verse. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Daniel did what he always did. He was not engaging in some sort of crisis prayer meeting. He didn't go out and publicly pray in front of Darius's castle. He went to his upper room, so to speak, and prayed as he always did, beginning by giving thanks. He wasn't making a spectacle, and he wasn't hiding. He was doing what he always continuously did. And so they came and they listened, and they brought lots of people to listen so that they would have witnesses that they could go to Darius and spin the issue. And they said, Daniel pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you signed, the prohibition you signed. But verse 14, which is what follows right after them telling the king, we've set the trap and it's sprung on Daniel. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, not like Nebuchadnezzar with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they said, we can't bow down to you, we worship the one true God. Nebuchadnezzar was tremendously angry and threw them in the fiery furnace. Darius is distressed, not like Nebuchadnezzar. He is distressed because he now has realized the foolishness of what he has done, and they've got him in the trap, and he has to go through with it, and he is upset and distressed with those who sprung this trap. He was determined to rescue Daniel, and he made every effort until sundown to save him. Then verse 15, then the men went as a group to the king and said to him, remember, O king, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, unhappily, I believe, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, now there's a couple of different translations that are a little bit different. As I mentioned, the New English Bible says that the king spoke and said to Daniel, your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you. That's an expression of faith. The New International translates it slightly different. It says, may your God whom you serve continually rescue you. Then the king had caused a stone to be brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Sounds a little bit like the body of Jesus being buried in the tomb that Joseph of Arimathea provided. They rolled a stone over it, put the seal on it. I don't recall now if there was a Roman seal placed on it. Both times, that's for the protection of the one sealed inside, not to keep them from getting out. The king didn't want these guys that he already doesn't like now because they have put him in a position to cause him to issue a death warrant for his favored administrator. He doesn't want them to go in there and kill Daniel if God's protection is going to protect Daniel from the lions. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. He slept a sleepless, troubled night, while Daniel spent a night of peace in the presence of the angel of God. Verse 19, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, a statement of faith. Servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue from the lions? Darius recognizes the continuous attitude of prayer that Daniel has been engaged in all his life. Thus, an example to us, a lesson to each of us. If we will pray to God on a regular basis, even have a special place like Daniel in his upper room, or some even say on the roof. I don't think it can be the roof because he talks about windows. And he does so on a regular basis, giving thanks to God and presenting his positions, his thoughts, even his needs and requests to God. When things are going well, it's easier to do so when things are not, to pray to God when things are not going well. This morning, or actually yesterday's devotional from Max Lucado talks about a man sitting in a dingy room with chains on his hands and his feet. Look at him as older, balding, and you would think he's been there, and he has been there for some time, that he would be bitter and upset. Instead, it is Paul, and in all likelihood, he is writing the letter of joy to the Philippians. Daniel has established a pattern of prayer all his life, and we should do the same. Daniel answered the king's call. O king, live forever. My God sent his angels, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. Verse 24 in our last verse. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted his God. I'm sorry, that's verse 23. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Peter warns us that the lions represent Satan. In chapter 5, verses 8 and 9 of 1 Peter, he wrote, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. In Hebrews chapter 11, sometimes called the faith chapter, the author, be that Barnabas or be that Paul, the author is not certain. I don't think it was Paul, but some suggest it is, talks about those men and women of faith who were delivered from crises by God. But also, I think it's in verse 35 and following, talks about those who are delivered from the crisis into the presence of God himself, that is, through death. Not everybody is delivered from the crises of this world. Daniel, however, provides us with the means to stand firm in the face of Satan, the roaring lion who desires to devour us. That is, to pray to God, make that a practice of your life, so that when times of crises come, your closeness to God is reaffirmed over and over. Another interesting, great lesson from the book of Daniel. Thank you for joining with us in this study again this morning. Good morning.